According to military statistics, during the difficult period of the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Army lost an average of 67 armored vehicles daily, including tanks of various modifications and self-propelled artillery units. Each of these combat vehicles was operated by a brave crew, and unfortunately, far from all members of these crews survived a collision with a treacherous anti-tank mine or a direct hit from an enemy shell. Some of these crews, demonstrating incredible courage and skill, managed to destroy dozens of enemy armored vehicles, while others, unfortunately, died in battle without even managing to fire a single shot back. Everything depended on the level of professional training of each crew member, their coordination, as well as the unpredictable military luck, which, as is known in war, can turn in any direction. In the summer of 1944, the Soviet Army, having accumulated significant reserves of both manpower and military equipment, conducted a large-scale offensive on many fronts, ranging from the territories of Moldova to the Baltic republics. Armored vehicles played, without exaggeration, a key role in breaking through the enemy's deeply echeloned defenses. Tank formations launched swift and devastating attacks, cutting through German defenses to a considerable depth, developed the achieved successes, and engaged in fierce clashes with enemy units in counter-battles, not giving them time to regroup. Only those who directly participated in these bloody battles can truly understand what price the Soviet tank crews paid for these long-awaited victories. The tank company, commanded by Senior Lieutenant Ilya Terpky, having received an order to advance, went into a deep breakthrough, leaving far behind the rear units of their Guards Tank Brigade. At the same time, they had only a minimal amount of fuel left in their tanks and an extremely limited supply of ammunition. The tankers traveled a difficult route of more than 200 kilometers along grueling roads without any stops or opportunities to rest, at the limit of human capabilities, while the rubber bandages of the road wheels were almost completely destroyed and every last horsepower was squeezed out of the tank engines. The commander's tank, decorated with an identification star and the tactical number 26 painted on the turret, while moving along a lowland just before the start of the ascent, ran onto rocky ground and, as they say, derailed. The right track completely slipped off the guide wheels. Three other tanks, which were moving slightly lower down the slope, did not manage to react in time and fell directly into a treacherous marshy area. It was strictly forbidden for the crew to leave a combat vehicle that had only lost a track, since according to combat regulations, it was supposed to fire from the tank, even if it was immobilized. But in the conditions of real combat operations, when every moment counts, it was necessary to continue the offensive as quickly as possible. Therefore, the priority task was to restore the track belt as quickly and efficiently as possible. Despite the complete absence of any artillery support or cover, as paratroopers on the armor of the tank there were 5 penal soldiers armed with a light machine gun. These brave guys immediately took up advantageous positions behind the nearest stones, covering the tankers during repair work. In the tank crew, the division of responsibilities was rather conditional and depended on the specific situation, while the tank commander was unscrewing the plug to gain access to the track tensioning mechanism. The mechanic driver and the loader wielded heavy crowbars, trying to manually adjust the track links, considering the fact that the track weighed almost a ton. After the successful and rather quick restoration of the track belt, the tank overcame the ascent with great difficulty and moved at high speed across an open field towards the nearest buildings. Behind the commander's tank, 3 more combat vehicles followed, not counting the 3 that had gotten stuck in the marshy area. Arriving at a small hamlet, the tank stopped in a small garden, which was located in its very center. The German infantry, left without artillery and tank support, preferred to retreat in an organized manner, avoiding unnecessary losses. The ammunition in the commander's tank was almost completely exhausted during previous battles. Only 2 last shells remained in the turret, 1 shrapnel and 1 subcaliber. The situation was no better for the other crews, and Lieutenant Bryson's vehicle was completely out of action. The tank's gun was awkwardly sticking straight into the sky, as if it intended to repel an attack by enemy aircraft. The mechanic driver miscalculated the trajectory of movement a bit. The lieutenant began to justify himself. The lifting mechanism was torn off when we were crossing the trench at full speed. The barrel simply hit the ground. "You will give the remaining ammunition to the guys," Turpke ordered peremptorily. Yes, there's practically nothing left. About 5 minutes later, the mechanic of Ilya Turpke's tank raised his head and, looking intently into the distance, pointed to something to the senior lieutenant. "Commander, it seems that German tanks have appeared." Turpke, quickly grabbing his binoculars and looking in the indicated direction, confirmed after a few agonizing seconds. "That's right, a Ferdinand self-propelled gun. It's moving. I must admit, quite slowly. Perhaps it's afraid of running into a minefield or is waiting for its infantry to approach for support for now. I only see one vehicle. I can't see the number on the turret. The distance is approximately 1 kilometer." Everyone understood perfectly well that at such a distance, the Ferdinand's powerful rifle gun would easily pierce the armor of the T-34, while the Soviet gun, in order to inflict at least some damage on this steel behemoth, needed to hit it exactly in the side, which was extremely difficult. As if on command, the tankers quickly took their places in the combat vehicles. The commander's tank overcame a small obstacle and drove into an open position so that no buildings would obstruct the view and aimed fire. Turpke, without losing a second, pushed the gunner aside. "Wait, Kolya, I'll take the shot myself. The risk in this situation is too great. We need to hit the enemy with the first shot if he turns around. Then our shell will be like a mosquito bite to him. And without ammunition, he will destroy us in a matter of seconds." Behind the German self-propelled gun, German infantry soldiers also appeared. Ilya, taking aim, showed unprecedented diligence and composure. He was not in a hurry. There was no trembling at all. He, a Komsomol member and an atheist, prayed mentally at this critical moment. Yes, he whispered to himself, "Lord, please make him stop at least for 5 seconds, at least for 2. He continued to pray and slowly guided the sight after the slowly crawling Ferdinand. Ilya had every right to press the trigger, but he was still waiting and hoping that the self-propelled gun would stop in order to hit it for sure and not give the enemy a single chance to escape. And suddenly, as if by magic, it stopped. Turpke smoothly pressed the trigger. A bright flame flared up over the Ferdinand, and then a thick black column of smoke rose into the sky. The commander, remaining outwardly calm, watched to see if anyone would appear from the damaged vehicle. No one was visible. "Now, shrapnel. Kolya, give me the shrapnel shell faster." The commander, without losing time, again leaned up to the gun. The German soldiers had already rushed into a panicked retreat, but the tanker was not going to spare them. The shell hit exactly in the center of the retreating group, destroying at least 20 people. The tankers, getting out of the vehicles, breathed a sigh of relief. They hugged Ilya and shook his hand firmly. However, the joy was short-lived and passed quickly. The company commander felt a growing unease. His rich combat experience and intuition told him that this was far from the last counterattack by the Germans. They would definitely pull up reserves, strengthen their positions, and... The senior lieutenant was not worried for nothing and mistrusted the ensuing calm. There in the west, behind the small folds of the terrain, an attentive observer noticed the characteristic outlines of the muzzle brakes of tank guns. It was absolutely clear to any experienced tanker. These were the guns of the heavy tanks Tiger. 10 heavy German tanks were rapidly approaching the hamlet. A Tiger in skilled hands in a maneuverable battle was much more dangerous than any self-propelled unit. The Germans had not yet discovered the Soviet tanks, which were skillfully hidden in the garden, as well as the 3 vehicles that had gotten stuck in the marshy area. Turpke, without hesitating for a second, tried to contact them by radio, but unfortunately, no one answered. The senior lieutenant cursed under his breath. Well, those bastards. They didn't leave anyone at the radio. Damn them. The commander had absolutely no doubt the Tigers were heading right here to eliminate the breakthrough and destroy the impudent Soviet tankers. And he had only 4 vehicles. To be precise, only 3. Bryson could no longer be counted on. Bryson, how many armor-piercing shells do you have left? 2. So, we have 3 tanks and 5 armor-piercing shells against a whole company of Tigers. There are 2 options, Lieutenant. A heroic death in an unequal battle or an organized retreat. Those in the swamp, of course, don't see the Germans. Maybe our guys have already been able to pull their vehicles out of the swamp. And what will they be able to do if the Tigers go into a frontal attack? You can at least shoot into the sky from your anti-aircraft gun so that the Lord hears us. Turkey still could not forgive Bryson for breaking the gun, and they have as much ammunition left as a cat has cried. All the crews came up to discuss the situation. After a quick consultation, a decision was made. We needed to retreat immediately. Death can only be justified if it brings at least some benefit or can somehow affect the further course of events. And what about here? Only to ruin the tanks and ourselves, and for absolutely nothing. Get to the vehicles. The tanks quickly and in an organized manner left their hiding place. Immediately, shells from the powerful guns of the Tigers flew after them. Dozens of deadly shells whistled nearby, but fortunately none of them reached their target. Under the enemy's barrage, the T-34s rushed with such incredible speed that even Koshkin himself, the designer of the tank, would have been surprised by such agility and maneuverability of his creation. However, what surprised the commander the most was the fact that the 3 tanks stuck in the swamp, as if by magic, had broken out of there and were rushing after them on a parallel course. They stopped at a small village where other units of the Soviet army were already stationed. First of all, Turkey went to Sergeant Zakharov, the commander of one of the tanks that was stuck in the swamp, and asked him, "How did you orient yourself if you didn't see the Tigers?" Zakharov took off his helmet, scratched the back of his head, and answered with a grin. "It's all clear, Comrade Commander. You wouldn't have been running away like you were scalded if you hadn't been beaten up the first time. And what were we supposed to do in this situation?" They got some food from the supply troops of other units, which fortunately were not that far away. They had barely started to eat when some infantry lieutenant colonel, all red with anger, came running up and started shouting, "Cowards! Ingloriously retreated, surrendered the hamlet to the enemy. Senior Lieutenant, come to me immediately." Turkey, slowly and with obvious contempt, demonstratively finished his meager ration, carefully hid his spoon, and only then approached the lieutenant colonel. "What do you think you're doing, Lieutenant? Refusing to obey my orders?" According to regulations, not even the commander-in-chief has the right to interrupt the meal of soldiers. "What?" The lieutenant colonel of short stature was completely beside himself and, jumping on his toes, continued, "While the entire Red Army is irresistibly rushing westward, a bunch of cowards, and from the Guards Brigade at that, without shame or conscience, are abandoning their positions and running away from the enemy, comma." The lieutenant colonel would probably have continued to lecture and moralize the tank crews if Turkey, unable to endure this unjust attack, had not snapped and declared to him for all to hear, "Where was your infantry, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel? You were supposed to support us and cover us. We were stuck on an open hill for 2 hours without any ammunition. So, in your opinion, we, the infantry, aren't fighting? I've never seen a lieutenant colonel in battle." By this time, all the other tankers had joined in, who, after all they had been through, had no respect for the shouting and completely unjust lieutenant colonel. They began to openly snap back, and the situation was about to come to the use of firearms. But fortunately, the Germans intervened again in the situation. Soviet IL, 2 ground attack aircraft suddenly appeared in the sky. And here, the unfortunate fact that the forward units, which had broken far ahead, were not aware of the latest signals for interaction with aviation, played its cruel joke once again. But the Germans were aware. Their intelligence worked like clockwork. They launched a white rocket towards the village. and the ground attack aircraft, without much thought, began to approach the village where our troops were located. The tanks were standing with their left side to the fence, and there was an open field to the right. It looked like it was boiling, covered with fountains of dust raised by the bursts of the ground attack aircraft. The infantry lieutenant colonel, who had spoken so eloquently and enthusiastically about heroism, immediately, like a frightened hare, ducked under the nearest tank. The IL-2s formed a circle and began their deadly carousel, firing at everything around them with guns and machine guns. Some soldiers fell dead, others screamed frantically from unbearable pain. It was good that the numerous trees partially covered the tanks from the fire. The senior lieutenant understood that the ground attack aircraft also had rockets in store, so he needed to act quickly. He rushed to his tank and took out a signal flare gun. A white stripe streaked through the sky in the direction of the German positions, immediately followed by a second. Someone else also realized that it was necessary to take at least some urgent action. The deadly carousel was disrupted. The IL-2s fired at the hamlet that the tankers had just left, and turning around, flew to their airfield to report on the completion of the combat mission. The lieutenant colonel, with difficulty crawling out from under the tank after everything had subsided, was covered in mud from head to toe, and his arrogance was gone. Without looking at the tankers, he silently went his own way, and Turpke, without losing time, headed to the newly arrived tanks. This was the second company of their battalion, and the battalion headquarters arrived shortly after. It was necessary to report to the battalion commander as soon as possible about the acquisitions, and the losses suffered. When the senior lieutenant came back from the commander, the sun was already setting. At this time, a division of Guards rocket launchers, Katyusha, launched a massive strike on the ill-fated hamlet, where there were no Soviet tankers or German soldiers anymore. What can you say? The day was, to put it mildly, quite something. The German front was cracking at the seams. Enemy troops were hastily retreating, suffering heavy losses. The Soviet offensive continued, gaining momentum with each passing day. The day was coming to an end. How many more such difficult and deadly days the T-34 with the tactical number 26 would have to live through? No one could even guess.